Hello and welcome to another digimediapros.com tutorial. I'm your host, Marcelo Lewin. Today, my guest presenter is Patrick Southern, an assistant editor in Los Angeles who specializes in Final Cut Pro 10 workflows. He has worked on documentary projects for A&E, National Geographic, and the Lifetime Movie Network. Welcome, Patrick.
Thanks, Marcel, for having me.
The goal of this video series, Final Cut Pro versus Premiere Pro, is not really to start a war or to convince people to use one app over the other. The goal is to provide enough information so that users understand how to perform similar tasks in both apps. In the last episode of this series, Jon Belew, another guest presenter, and I showed you how to create a project, import media, manage that media, create your first sequence, and adjust its settings. In this episode, Patrick and I will show you the timeline and its related panels and the different ways to bring footage into your timeline. So Patrick, before we get started, I just had a couple of questions for you if you're good with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
The first question is, have you used Premiere Pro before?
I have actually just worked on a docu-series that was both Final Cut 10 and Premiere. That was interesting.
Okay, so you know how to use Premiere Pro.
You know, I'm okay with it. I'm not a master by any means.
So when you see that I'm doing something wrong, just ignore it. Don't correct me.
I highly doubt that that will happen. I expect to learn quite a bit.
All right, well, that's good. Same here with Final Cut Pro 10. Now, what's the one thing you love the most about Final Cut Pro 10?
That's a hard question. You know, I'm an assistant editor, so I think organization is maybe one of my favorite things in terms of, you know, getting the footage where it should be and so forth. So your episode with Jon is like exactly the sort of stuff that I love. But the timeline is also a lot of fun, especially, well, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but the use of roles and not having to worry about track assignments so much is kind of a relief for me and for the editors I work with when it comes to getting your media in quickly and not having to worry about, is it V1, V2, V3?
So what's your most exciting editing project you've worked on and why? What made it exciting?
Probably the most comprehensive project that I worked on was OJ Speaks for A&E. And we had, I think it was between 31 and 36 hours of deposition footage of O.J. Simpson and a few other witnesses in his civil trial. So we had a bunch of footage that we were going through, and that was a lot of fun and was interesting. But probably the project that I've worked on that I'm most proud to have been a part of was for National Geographic. We had a project called Challenger Disaster: The Lost Tapes, and it's just a very moving piece, and seems to be less what's the word for OJ was kind of like a reality show-esque moment in the 90s, and Challenger was kind of more like a national loss and something that I think brought us all together as opposed to being so divisive. So I'd have to say of the projects I've worked on, Challenger Disaster would probably have to be the one I'm most proud to be a part of.
Well, unrelated to editing, but I still remember the disaster itself. I was in school, in high school, so that just told you my age, but but I still remember that. I mean, it was, like you said, a national tragedy.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, we're going to get started because I know our viewers are itching to see the stuff, so I'll get started, and then we'll switch to you after I'm done showing the Adobe Premiere Pro.
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay, so here we are in Adobe Premiere Pro. Now, I'm not going to talk about projects or how to create a project or how to import media because we've already done that in episode 1. But we're going to start at the point where we already have a sequence loaded into our timeline. And the first thing I want to talk about is the interface and give you a quick overview of the interface because it's important to understand all the parts. On the top left, you have the source monitor. This is where you preview all your footage before you bring it into the timeline. Right here on the top right, you have the actual program monitor, and this basically showing you what's in the timeline itself, where your timeline indicator is. On the bottom left, you have your project panel, and it's important because you can actually manage your media through the project panel and bring it into the timeline. And then, of course, right here, this is your actual sequence or the timeline. Now, one thing I want to mention that you could do is you can, for example, I'm going to go into another episode and open up this sequence and then open up this sequence. So you can see I can have multiple sequences open at one time, and all I have to do is just switch between them by clicking on them. So we're going to go ahead and close this. We'll go ahead and close that, and we'll go ahead and close this project. So we have this open here. So that is sort of a quick overview. Also, one thing I failed to mention is right here, you have all your editing tools, but we're not going to go into all of these in this episode. We will reserve that for a different episode that Patrick and I will be doing specifically on editing inside the actual timeline. So I'm going to click on the timeline or the sequence, and you can see I have a blue bar around it. That means this window is now active. I can hit the backslash, and that'll show me the entire timeline. I can also hit the plus button to zoom in and to zoom out of the timeline. So those are kind of handy keys that we can use around the timeline itself. Now, one of the things I want to talk about is the actual timeline and what do all these things here mean. So first thing you'll notice is that anything in pink, it's usually going to be a graphic. Blue is your video. And then below, which you see green here, this is your audio. So you have video at the top, audio at the bottom, and I can move this up and down if you have more audio or more video to work with. I can also hit the Shift plus to make the actual tracks taller so I can see a little bit more detail, especially if you want to start seeing the waveforms of the audio files, as you can see down there. So I'm going to hit Shift minus, and that brings it down to just a color line.
Marcelo, quick question regarding when you're able to expand the video and you're able to expand the audio, is there a way to expand just one over the other?
And with the mouse and the scroll wheel, you can just put your mouse over the actual track you want to expand. As you can see, I'm only expanding this, and I'm using the track wheel to do that.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So I can do just right, because I do that all the time. I only want this, right, the audio, because I want to know where to start it or where to do the endpoint.
Right. That's something that I like to do, be able to get very specific. So that's interesting that you're able to go track by track. Is there a way to do like all of the audio or all of the video, or is it kind of all or nothing?
Good question. I'm going to say no, and then I'm going to get 100 comments saying you are wrong. But for now, I'm going to say no.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Yeah, and that is a good question where you just expand all of the audio only. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. So that is a little bit on how to expand your tracks and how to see more. Now let's start with the columns here. On the columns you have, this is your source patching. This is the lock. This is your track targeting. This is sync lock, and this is visibility. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the left. And this is your source patching. And the source patching, basically, you're telling which track you want the footage that you're going to bring in from either your project or your source monitor, where do you want it to land. And the same thing with audio. So you can see that I can click on this track and click on this track here. And now if I bring in any footage from the source or the project panel, it'll land wherever the timeline indicator is. It'll land there. Whether it's going to be an insert or an override depends on which button you use. But that's your source patching button. Now you can only select one at a time. Now the other cool thing that you can do, which a lot of people don't know, is you can hit the Alt or Option key in Mac and Alt in PC. And if you select it, you'll see a little black border around it. Same with audio. Now if I click on Insert, what's going to happen, it's going to insert black or silence. So for example, let's say you want 10 seconds of black or silence, you can do that and then select 10 seconds here and then bring in just silence or black. And you don't have to do for both. You can just say, I want the audio, but I want black for the video and vice versa. And that's with selecting the Option or Alt key in Windows and Option in Mac. The next one up is the lock key. So the lock key will basically lock your track. So if I click on the lock here and click on the lock here, if I bring in an insert, and I'm going to go ahead and do that, we'll go ahead and go to the program monitor real quick. I'm going to move the mouse over here, click on I, then move it over here, click on O. Let's see my input and output, and I'm going to do an insert. You're going to see that it actually did an insert on the actual tracks above it and below it, but it did not affect the lock tracks. I'm going to hit Command Z or Control Z to undo, and then I'm going to click on the lock to unlock a track. Now, locking a track will completely lock it, meaning that you cannot edit it, you cannot apply effects, you can't do anything to it. So it is a good way to protect that track, but sometimes you want to do something else where you're just bringing in footage but not affecting the track without locking it, and I'll show you how to do that. The track targeting, you can target multiple tracks at a time. That's this here, the third column. Now, track targeting means whenever you're doing anything on the timeline, which track do you want to target? So right now I have, let's say, track V1 selected. Now, you can use the track targeting to navigate across all the clips within the timeline. You can also use track targeting to copy and paste clips. So now that I have A1 selected and V1 selected, if I hit the up arrow and down arrow, that'll take me to the next edit. So in V1, it should take me, we'll go ahead and zoom in a bit. It should take me to, since we have V1, here's my first edit. Then it's, we'll zoom in so you can see. There's the second edit because I have A1 also targeted. And then it takes me to this edit here and this edit here, right? The video and audio because it's targeted. So if I click on up again, it'll take me only to V1. I don't have any more audio. If I click it up again, it'll take me to V1. So this allows me to target certain tracks so I can move around. So for example, if I do V2 now and I hit the down key, it'll take me to the end of V1, which is the first edit point. But then the second edit point is V2. If I go again, now we are at V1 edit point and actually A1 edit point as well. Then we are at V2 edit point, then at V2 edit point again. So you get the gist of the targeting. I'm going to hit the backslash so I can see everything. The other reason you want to target your track is because you may want to copy a clip. So for example, let's go ahead. We have a clip up here, which this is just a lower thirds here that I may want to copy and paste in other places. I'm going to select it and then I'm going to hit Command or Control C. And then I'm going to put my timeline indicator somewhere else. Now I have V2 as target selection. So if I hit Control V, which will do an overwrite, you'll see that it overrode V2. Now I'm going to go ahead and undo this. I'm going to select V3 instead. And if I deselect V2, and then if I do a Command or Control V again, it puts it in place. So that's another reason why you might want to do some target tracking. Now, the big question is going to be, well, what if I'm targeting 3 tracks? What happens? Well, it'll target the lowest track. So right now I have V1, 2, and 3. So the lowest one is V1. So if I do Command V or Control V, it puts it in V1. If I deselect V1 and just leave V2 and V3, of course, it'll put it in V2. So that's something for you to keep in mind. Same thing with the audio, right? If I have audio 1, 2, and 3, the lowest audio is A1. Not the lowest as in location here, but the lowest number. So the lowest here is A1. So it always target the lowest number track. Now, next up is the sync lock. That's this here. So when you have sync lock on, it's going to try to keep the audio and video completely in sync always. So if I do an insert here, we'll target A2 for the audio, and we'll target V3 for the video, for the source, and we'll do an insert right now. It's actually going to break the audio because it wants to keep the audio with the video in sync. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. And now I'm going to say sync lock. So it'll leave the audio in place. If I do an insert now, it left the audio completely in place because it really doesn't matter. I don't need it to be in sync with the video. Now, of course, in this case, I do need it to be in sync. But that's one of the reasons you want to use your sync lock button. The next one up is the track output. And basically, this will either show or not show your track. So this works just like in Photoshop where you can turn off a layer. So I can go ahead and turn off the V2 here. And it won't show the bug, which was right here at the bottom left. If I turn it back on, you can see it's right there. So if I turn visibility off on V1, there goes V1, and I can turn it back on. And that's on the video portion. On the audio portion, everything pretty much is the same. Where you're going to see a difference is in the mute and solo. And what the mute does, it'll mute this track. The solo will mute all other tracks except this track, which means that this track will play solo. And then finally, what I want to show you here is this is a master track for audio, and then you can use this to lower the volume of the entire audio mix all at once. So For example, if the entire audio mix is balanced, but then it's a bit too hot, you can just bring the master volume down. So you can do that here by entering dBs or entering 0 to leave it at base.
With that master track, are there things other than just volume that you can adjust? Can you adjust like EQ or pan or anything like that?
Not in the master, through the master track. You can add effects to each of these audio tracks, or of course, better yet, you can go into Audition and then do all your mixing there. Now, bringing in footage, I'm going to go ahead and put my timeline indicator over here somewhere. You can bring in footage from your project panel. You can bring in footage from your source monitor. Or you can do some things with your footage in your program monitor. So for example, I'm going to go to the program monitor, to the timeline here, and I'm going to start with the program monitor. In the program monitor, for example, let's set an in point. We'll go ahead and press play for a minute right there. So we'll set an in point here.
It is normal. Yeah, for editorial, the NLEs of choice.
And then we'll set an out point here. And I can actually now do either a lift or an extract. So I'm going to go ahead and target V2, and I clicked on lift, and it lifted what was targeting as V2 and A1. Now I can go ahead and undo it, and I can go ahead and extract. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. So those are the couple of things you can do, and I'm going to go ahead and clear my in and out point.
Marcelo, when you do that extract and it does the ripple effect, does it just do that to the tracks that you've targeted, or does it do it to all tracks to keep everything in sync?
It'll keep everything in sync. So let's go ahead and do that again. We'll go ahead and do an in. Press play.
So like Premiere, there's obviously
we'll do an out. Let's zoom in just a couple, and then we'll do an extract, and it brings everything. You saw the entire timeline moved.
Yeah, and it did that. I guess the area I was interested was V1, and yeah, it looks like it split that in two as well. That's interesting. That's very helpful.
Yeah. So we'll go ahead and clear in and out. Okay. So that's in the program monitor. In the source monitor, you've got two buttons here, which you can do an insert or an override. Again, using your source patching. Remember, you have to select source patching. So for example, if I deselect, notice that even though track V3 is selected, I turned it off. If I do right now an insert or an override, nothing's going to happen, and nothing is happening. So not only do you have to select the source of the track, but you also have to turn it on. So for example, if I do a V1 right now, and I do an insert, it inserted just the video because I didn't select audio, right? In V1. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. And if I select audio, and then I do, let's say, an insert again, it inserted, and we'll go ahead and go to the timeline, the sequence, hit backslash to see the entire timeline, and you can see what it did. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. In the source monitor, you can also select in points and out points by clicking on I and then playing to wherever you want to, and click on O, and that selects your points. And then, of course, you can then insert or overwrite using the buttons here, or the shortcuts, the comma and the period. You can do that easily. You can also drag and drop footage. So I can take this and drag it wherever I want to, or I can select only the audio and then drag it, or I can select only the video and then drag it and position it wherever I want to. So that's working with the source monitor. On the project side, you can go ahead and, for example, select a video, and again, I can drag and drop it into the timeline directly. I can right-click and say insert or override, and it'll insert or override depending on your source patching that you've done. Or I can go into the icon view as well. And then let's go into, actually we'll go back to list view. We'll go into raw video here, and then we'll go into icon view. Now in icon view, I see the actual videos here. I can click on a video and I'll get a timeline scrubber, and I can play the video. But I'm going to set an in point by clicking I, then I'm going to continue playing. Set an out point by clicking O, and then I can right click and say insert or overwrite. And of course, it'll put it over my source patch. So that's another way to bring in video from your project panel. I'm gonna go ahead and undo that.
That's pretty cool. Can you do multiple in and outs on the same clip, or is it limited to just the one at a time? Or
the one at a time? Yeah. Good question though. So that pretty much covers how to bring in footage into your timeline and what the timeline is. I'm personally excited to learn more about the Final Cut Pro 10 timeline because I know it is radically different, especially the elastic timeline as you guys call it. So Patrick, I'm going to pass it on to you.
All right, so now that we've taken a look at Premiere, let's talk just a little bit about the UI here in Final Cut. For those of you who aren't familiar, in the upper left, there's this quadrant here called, I guess actually it's not a quadrant, it's a third of the screen. Anyway, this third of the screen, upper left third, is called the browser. Back in the olden days of Final Cut, it was called the event browser, but now there's more than just events in it. By the way, an event is kind of like a bin. So we've got our browser up here in the upper left-hand corner. We've got the viewer instead of the program monitor over here on the right-hand side. And then we've got the timeline down here. And instead of calling the thing that we open in the timeline a sequence, we call it a project. So there is that slight difference. Now, if you're just absolutely hankering to have the source and program experience, if you go to Window, it says Show Event Viewer, and now you can see I've got the ability. I can scrub just the event viewer, or I can scrub the timeline.
Now, I have a quick question for you on the event viewer. So let's say you do have this, and I understand from previous conversations with you that normally you wouldn't have the event viewer open. But if you do, in Premiere Pro, you can load from the timeline, you can load the clip back to the source monitor, which would be your event viewer. Can you do that, or no, that doesn't work that way in Final Cut Pro?
See, that's a good question. I use it so little that I don't know off the top of my head, but let's find out real quick. Okay, so I've got this clip of the boats in the ocean within my my normal viewer, which would be kind of like your program monitor, and then I'll press Shift F to match back, and in fact, it does load the uncolor corrected version here.
So just like Premiere Pro.
Normally, we'll hide the event viewer. It's not normally open, so whenever I'm in the timeline, it previews the timeline, and then here I'll do our match back again, Shift F, and it will take me back to that moment. And you can see if I zoom in a little bit, it's already got the range selected as well. But again, I'm up here, we've got the non-color corrected version, or I've got the color corrected version down here in the timeline. So it depends on what you have selected as to what shows up in the viewer. So that's kind of how the viewer works. And again, we can do the event viewer if we want to, but a lot of Final Cut 10 editors will not because they're so used to doing things with just the viewer. We don't have the capability, and I guess this is something we can go into depth a little bit further later. We don't have the option to drag footage into the viewer to pull it into the timeline. Like I said, we'll get into that in a little bit later. We don't have track targeting per se either, because in Final Cut 10 there aren't tracks. There are instead, it's kind of split into two different items, if you will. The functionality of tracks go into things that are called roles and storylines. So if we're looking here at our timeline, by the way, whereas I think you were saying you were doing the backslash key, is that how you zoomed to fit?
Correct.
Okay, so you would do backslash, but here in Final Cut 10, instead you do Shift Z, and that will bring the timeline in full view.
And that's from old Final Cut Pro 7 days, because I remember I used to do that.
Yeah, Shift Z, man. It's a great keyboard shortcut. And, you know, it's odd, and we'll talk about tilde a little bit later, but, you know, there's some functionality where all of a sudden the tilde key that you wouldn't use in any other application both becomes useful in Premiere and in Final Cut 10. But so here, looking at our timeline, you'll kind of see that there's this dark region. In fact, if we scroll to the right, you can see there's just kind of this dark region in the middle that doesn't seem to make sense compared to most other NLEs. And then there's a brighter gray and a brighter gray on either side. This darker gray section is called the primary storyline. It's kind of like if V1 and A1 were in the same place, if that makes any sense whatsoever. It's kind of where you would put the spine of your footage. So if it's music driven, you might put music there. If it's VO driven, you might put VO there. I did not follow that typical advice in this particular project. And in fact, I've got my VO in a secondary storyline. So you can see, maybe I should turn off clip skimming, but you can see I've got through here, I've got various pieces of footage, and then down here I have kind of this little bar that seems to have other things in it, and this is what's called a secondary storyline. And we've got another one up here, and a secondary storyline can act very similar to a track, but it also isn't just limited to a certain vertical space. It can move, I can move this secondary storyline below the primary storyline. I can have it above. I can have it above or below another secondary storyline. As you can see, I'm not very good at demonstrating that, but here we go. So we've got, two secondary storylines stacked atop one another. I'm going to undo that real quick. So we've got our secondary storylines that, again, kind of act like tracks, except that it's really more just like a grouping of clips that you want to be in relation to time to one another, but you also want to be able to maybe move them together or have them in the same vertical space and organized in that way. And then the other aspect that we have that's similar in functionality to a track is what's called a roll. And rolls are something that you kind of have to set up. You don't have to set up at the top, but you really should. You should set your rolls early so that whenever it comes to audio mixing or outputting your deliverables, you've already got that all done and you're not having to go through individual clips in the timeline and assign them their role at that point in time. So for example, we can take all of this footage, and if we open up what's called the inspector over here on the right-hand side, we'll go to the info panel, and you'll see that it has a video roll. If I wanted to say that it was a title instead, I could do that. It's not a title, it's video. But you'll notice that for audio, I've got my dialogue and music and effects. So, for example, I can come in here to my VO event, and within my VO event, I can select all of these audio tracks and these audio cues, and I'll change the role from dialogue to specifically master VO, so that anytime I edit that footage into the timeline, now there's this wonderful little thing called the timeline index I can open, and I can select all of my master VO all at once.
So you can create your own roles, I'm assuming, right? So instead of just being video, can you have like B-roll, master roll, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely you can. So for example, I'll go to some B-roll. That's not all B-roll, actually. We'll go to some of this footage, and we'll select a few of these clips. And over here in the inspector, I can select, and I can go to Edit Roles. And if I want to, I can either create a brand new video roll, or I can create a brand new audio roll. Although I recommend not doing that very often. I would do it, for example, if you knew you were going to have audio stems and you wanted to have all of your stems in one place, I would maybe do a stem roll. What I would instead recommend is doing what's called a sub roll. So for video, I would do a sub roll of B-roll. And you can export just that video sub roll, right? So I can come in here, and this is all B-roll now. I say it is. Oh, some of it's got audio. So it says mixed because some of it's got audio. So the video has the video roll, and then the audio has the audio roll of, in this case, dialogue. In this case, there is no audio. But if this were, for whatever reason, instead of dialogue, maybe it's effects, because this is actually probably more accurately ambience in this shot, if I were to guess.
So the roles are, it seems like roles are being used as a way to organize your tracks. Let's say, I know you don't have tracks, but like if I have 2 tracks in Premiere Pro of titles and 2 tracks of B-roll and 1 track of video, it's kind of like organizing those title tracks into title roll. So that way when I deselect titles, it'll turn off all my titles regardless of where they're at.
Right. So for example, I can in fact take the title roll and I can disable it. Now, you should know that when you disable, that doesn't, in this particular case, whenever you're using the timeline index in this way, it's turning it off to view, but it will still export. So if you actually want to disable, you would go to clips and you would type in title, and then you would actually select your titles and in the timeline index and press Command 2, which highlights the timeline, and then you would press V, but it's not working because we have secondary storylines selected. So these little icons that look like film strips means that they're secondary storylines, and they came up in our search because beyond being a title, we also have things that have title in the name. I've named these secondary storylines, so I'll just grab these 2 titles that are within the secondary storylines. I'll press Command 2, and then I'll press V, and V disables them. So you can disable that way. Or, again, if you just want to turn on and off for the sake of viewing, then you've got this over here.
So how do you create a storyline?
A secondary storyline?
Right.
We'll have to add a little bit of footage. So I've got this shot of this barn, and I'm going to add it and maybe a few other shots. So I already made some selections previously, so I'm going to select it. And I guess now is as good a time as any to talk about how to get some footage into the timeline. I'm going to use this little trick called connected clip. So I'm going to add a connected clip to the timeline, and then I'll grab this tree, why not? And we'll add a connected clip, and we'll grab this, and it's a connected clip. And you'll notice that in the timeline, they're kind of being separated into different visual spaces, vertical spaces, which is not what we want. So what we do want is we want them all to be in a storyline together. Right now, I can move them individually, and they can stack and restack, and there's no evidence of kind of like timeline-ish behavior. So what I can do, there are a few ways I can do this. I can take these and make sure that they're kind of back to back to back. And to make sure that they are actually lined up properly, I'm going to turn on snapping, which is this little magnet icon. You can also press N on the keyboard. So I'll snap those together, and then those are snapped together. And if I have all 3 selected, I can press Command G, and it will create a secondary storyline. Alternately, I can take this clip and I can hold down the G key, and as I drag clips to each other, they will be added to that secondary storyline. And interestingly enough, now that I've got the secondary storyline, anytime I do an insert or an overwrite edit, it will do it within the secondary storyline, which is all sorts of fun.
And when would you typically create a secondary storyline, let's say in a TV show or in a corporate video?
Okay, that's a great question. Here, I'm going to move this out of the way real quick. One example is when you're using transitions between shots that are above the primary storyline. You cannot have transitions between shots without there being a storyline. So, for example, this segment right here, I'm just going to play it back real quick. So I've got a series of dissolves. So for that purpose, I need to have a secondary storyline. The other reason to have a secondary storyline, for example, something I've started doing, and I'm questioning whether it's actually the smartest way to do things, but I've created a secondary storyline for my VO, and then I add a gap generator between segments of VO so that I can space out my VO and still have my VO all together, so that I don't have, there are a few sound effects in here, for example, that are out on their lonesome. And if I want to be able to keep the relation in time, the same between those, that's when a secondary storyline would make sense. Another time that it makes a lot of sense is if, say, you've got an interview in your primary storyline and you've got a string of B-roll and it's related B-roll and you want it to always be together, then that would be a good time to create a secondary storyline. So maybe these 3 shots, are kind of already edited together and we like the pacing and I want to keep that B-roll sequence together. I can put it into a secondary storyline. And because it's in a secondary storyline, if I, want to have that moment, something that's easy to find, I can actually take the secondary storyline and I'll rename it Barn and Stars, right? So now if I'm ever curious about where my Barn and Stars sequence is, I can, sequence of shots, that is, not an actual Premiere sequence per se, but I can find that up in here.
And can you use that storyline across other projects?
It's not like a nest per se. There is another way to do that. That's what's called a compound clip. So I'm going to take these 3 out of their secondary storyline by pressing Command Option Up, and it will take them out of the secondary storyline. I'm going to select them all, and I can go File, New, Compound Clip, or I can do Option G, and I'm going to name this Barn and Stars. And I'm going to select, I like to have a VFX and compounds event because oftentimes my compound clips are in fact VFX, kind of like a pre-comp inside of After Effects. But, sometimes you would maybe have story lifts or something like that you'd put in there. So I'll press OK. And so if I were to ever match back to this compound clip, it does have a place in the browser, but I've also got it right here. So I can now, because I've got it as a nest, I can drag it wherever I want, and I can actually do things to the compound clip as a whole. So now if I wanted to apply an animation, for example, to the entirety of the clip, or I wanted to, change the opacity of the entirety of the compound clip, I could do that. So in that way, it's like a compound clip is kind of like a pre-comp, but it's also like, just a generally nested sequence. So if I wanted to, for example, add that same compound clip over here, I could do that. So now I've got the same compound clip twice in the same timeline. I didn't really finish talking about roles, did I? So yeah, you can add custom roles, and the big benefit for that is whenever you're doing an export, I can actually come in here and I can do roles as a multi-track QuickTime movie. So I can have a multi-track QuickTime that has the dialogue, and if I wanted to, I could add, well, I want specifically the master VO and this one to just be other dialogue. So I could do that, and they can be, patch stereo or surround or however. So roles are a great tool for organization within your own timeline, but it's also great for turning over deliverables back to track-based NLEs and digital audio workstations and so forth. Let's talk about the magnetic timeline for a second, because that seems to be something that's extremely different than working inside of Premiere or inside of Final Cut 7 or inside of Avid. So for example, I have this clip here with this guy running across these pillars, and you'll hear some, well, you can't hear them, but there are footsteps. And you can see those footsteps right here, and I've placed them as he lands on each pier. And so I want that timing to stay, like that, but maybe I want to switch this shot to a little bit earlier, so I can just grab this shot, and because these are in a connected secondary storyline, now they go with that shot. And, this also has kind of, quote, the elastic effect, where it automatically reorders clips as opposed to overwriting other clips, which also means that creating gap is difficult. So this might be better shown, like if I want to, I can't just pull to the right now. So there's no way to just generate space there unless I introduce what's called the position tool. So I'm going to select, in my toolbar, I'm going to select the position tool, and I can click and I can drag right. And now it's going to overwrite the clip that's on the right and generate what's called, we have gap generators. We don't just have blank space, we've got gap generators. And then I can pull this back And oh no, I'm destructive to my footage on either side. So I'll undo that real quick. So the position tool kind of gives you more functionality similar to the way that you would do things in Final Cut 7 in terms of overriding footage to the left and to the right and creating space on either side. So you can use the position tool, and again, that's here, to disable kind of the magnetism for a second. You still can't pull it out of the primary storyline using the position tool. Again, for that, you have to do Command Option up. And if you want to bring it back down into the primary storyline, Command Option down. But once you're outside of the primary storyline, then rearranging things vertically is much easier. There's also this issue of clip connections. Maybe there's an instance where I want to move a shot and I don't want the clips that are connected to move with the shot. I want the clips that are connected to stay in that moment in time because maybe they're actually related to a piece of music or to something else that's not in the primary storyline. Or maybe I just want to retain their timing because they've got this wonderful, amazing timing that I love so much. So, for example, again, if I move this, the connected clips go with it. But if I hold down the tilde key, which you would use to take a window full screen, I believe, in Premiere, now those clips, you can't hardly see, I guess. Here, we'll take this clip. Now those footsteps will stay in that same space and time. Whereas this clip I can move up and down, and it doesn't really matter. And if I want to retain the ability to move around without the clip connections, then I can hold down tilde, and after holding down tilde, then I press Command. You can't press them both at once. And then if you let up on tilde and then let go of Command, so it's kind of like in a horseshoe fashion, or it's like rocking a horse, like a rocking horse. So tilde, Command, release tilde, release Command. Now I've kind of got it in a permanent no connections mode. Now, as you'll notice, while I'm dragging this clip, other clips keep their connections to their audio and their secondary storylines, but the clip that I'm dragging does not retain that relationship. So those are a few ways to get around the elasticity of the magnetic timeline. But again, you can use it to great advantage. Probably the bigger reason to remove those clip connections, though, would be, for example, if I was going to just do like a slip or a slide edit and I wanted to leave an ambience in place or something like that. We haven't talked about how to get footage into the timeline. We're still pretty far along in the process without doing that. So here, let's open up. I've got this Mouse in the Morning opener. I've got a little web series I do called Mouse in the Morning. And so I'm going to open my Mouse in the Morning Season 2 footage, and I'm going to switch over. I've got thumbnail view. I like using thumbnail view for B-roll, but whenever I'm working with interview footage, I like to move into list view. And there's this fun little thing called lumberjack mode within, or not lumberjack mode, transcript mode within Lumberjack, which is a third-party piece of software that allows me to actually apply the transcript to my footage. And if I select this transcripts folder, I'm going to type in welcome, because I know my opener starts with welcome to Mouse in the Morning. And so I can now do one of three things. I can drag to the timeline. And if I'm going to do that, that will allow me to also, I can do a connected clip. And in fact, if I had, it won't let me do a connected clip to the right until I generate gap, which is Option W. So that's a typical gap generator. And then Command Option up to take that out of the storyline. Now I can create my secondary storyline with Command G. Okay, so again, I can drag things in. I can also, I've got these three buttons for connect, which will add your clip right above wherever the playhead is. I can do an insert with this button here. or I can do what's called an append, which an append puts it at the very end of the primary storyline. Or if you have a secondary storyline selected, then if you do append, it appends at the end of the secondary storyline. That also takes place for if I were going to do an insert. So if I were to do an insert, it would insert into the secondary storyline if I've got the secondary storyline selected.
What about the connect? Does connect only work with the primary storyline, or can you connect secondary storylines to other secondary storylines?
You cannot connect secondary storylines to other secondary storylines, which is kind of a bummer. There are definitely times when I would want to have a secondary storyline with, audio cues for footage in another secondary storyline. But as of current, that is not something that can be done. Also, there is the ability to overwrite, but it is not in the toolbar. You have to do edit, overwrite. And so you can do an overwrite edit that way. Or if we go to the edit menu, you can see that they all have keyboard shortcuts. Connect is Q, insert is W, append is E, and overwrite is D, or QWED, which on a QWERTY keyboard is actually all pretty easy to access. You can do it all with your left hand. So now I'm going to do a connected clip with Q. I'm going to insert at the playhead with W. I'm going to append with E. And then actually I don't really like it right here. I want to insert right here. But an insert isn't really what I need. I need to overwrite. So I'm going to press D. So I can Q, connect, insert, append, overwrite, QWED. So that's how we get footage into the timeline. And I suppose you may be wondering to yourself, well, what about all of my audio? How do I mix my audio if I've got multiple tracks of dialogue or so forth and so on? So for that, I'm going to pull in, I've got some newer footage that actually has multiple microphones in it. So I'm going to open this in the inspector, and you will see that I do, in fact, have... Oh, no, I don't. I'm in the wrong place. I do, in fact, have, in this footage, two microphones. Or actually two elements of the same microphone, and they face different directions. But you can come in here and you can label these. They're called audio components. So I can name this component Patrick Lav if it was a lavalier, or Andrew Boom if it was a boom mic. And now, whenever I edit that into the timeline, you still can't see the separate tracks or audio components, and that seems disconcerting. But if you go to Clip, Expand Audio Components, or Control Option S, you've got the ability to see your separate components. So that is how you unhide the hidden quote-unquote audio tracks when you're working with multi-track audio. That's about it with the timeline before we get into trimming with ripple, roll, slip, and slide. Marcelo, do you have any questions, or is there anything that you feel like I've left out?
No, you've done a great job, Patrick. Really, really good. The trimming and all that, we're going to leave that for our next episode that we're going to do together. But you gave us a really great overview of the timeline itself, which I know from my perspective, many of us find it not confusing, but definitely something new that you have to learn, right? Because with Final Cut 10, they went the non-traditional quote-unquote timeline. So this was a great way for us to truly understand storylines and the primary storylines and how to connect them together. So thank you so much for doing that. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, if people want to get a hold of you or learn more about you, do you want to give them a URL or website? Where do they want to go to?
Yeah, the best place to find me is on Twitter at JP Southern, and that's Southern like Southern California.
Patrick, thanks again. And to the rest of you, please check out more of our tutorials, videos, podcasts, and articles at digimediapros.com. So until the next tutorial, I'm Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.